I am Norma Levy, and I'm the founder and president of New Plaza Cinema. We're a nonprofit organization. And today, we're looking forward to a lively discussion about a terrific 1940 film, Dance Girl Dance, starring Maureen O'Hara, Louis Hayward, and Lucille Ball. So to begin, I am pleased to introduce the host for this talkback, our terrific curator, Gary Palmucci. Gary?
Okay, thank you, Norma. We're really doing this by the seat of our whatever's here today from the theater, but happy to be here anyway. In this 2023 Women's History Month, we've been delving both in our cinema and on the Zoomcast today into Dorothy Arzner, who was virtually the only woman to be a regular working Hollywood major studio director in the 1930s and 40s. We screened her 1932 film, Merrily We Go to Hell, last weekend at the cinema. And today, we're looking at Dance Girl Dance, which was released by RKO Pictures in 1940, the same year that Orson Welles commenced shooting Citizen Kane at the studio. And Dance Girl Dance seems to have become a sort of feminist film studies uber text. Despite its director's disavowal of any such strategies, which we'll hear more about later, for an uber text for its extensive focus on what is now called the male gaze, the intensive focus both in the use of extreme close-ups of so-called talent scouts, the obstreperous vocal and physical misbehavior of its mostly male burlesque house customers, and the physical and moral humiliation of several of its leading ladies. Dance Girl Dance actually starts out rather innocuously as a kind of multi-level boy meets, loses, pursues, eventually regains girl trajectory. But around the 40-minute mark, it moves via a long sequence in a rowdy burlesque hall into much more provocative territory, which I'm sure would have been featured in its theatrical trailer, Max, if we'd been only able to look at it.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Gary, we searched high and wide for the original trailer for Dance Girl Dance, and even the Criterion edition does not contain it. So we can only speculate how the picture was sold by RKO Radio Pictures. Dorothy Arzner had been freelancing throughout the 1930s. She had been at Paramount Pictures for 13 years, starting there as a manuscript typist, stenographer. Then she became a very important film editor at Paramount, cutting some of their major silent films, and then finally turning to direction there in 1927. So after her last Paramount film around 1932-33, she's going to freelance at a number of studios, including RKO Radio Pictures, which released Dance Girl Dance. This is going to be the second to last Dorothy Arzner feature. And as you say, Gary, it did achieve some kind of a cult following. It's been said this is probably the most discussed or analyzed of her films.
Right, the Jeanne Dielman of the 40s, perhaps, for those of us who are keeping up with that bit of scholarship. But as you did beautifully in your presentation at the cinema last weekend, you sort of traced Dorothy's whole career. She started out in silent pictures and started to hit her stride in the early 30s. She became lifelong close friends with Joan Crawford through directing one of Joan's lesser of her many pictures that she made in the 30s called The Bride Wore Red, which I have actually seen. Mm-hmm. And then catch us up again, what happens in the late 30s and early 40s when she lands at RKO?
Well, let's see. First of all, The Bride Wore Red was co-written by Tess Salinger, who with her husband, Frank Davis, wrote the script for Dance Girl Dance. So that seemed to have been an early stage of that collaboration. She is at RKO in 1940, and then 2 years later, she will make her last picture at Columbia Pictures, but she's doing work for the Women's Army Corps, doing wartime short work. And she, at the time she is doing her final feature that followed Dance Girl Dance, she is going to be sick for a year with pneumonia, with a form of pneumonia. And she comes out of that saying, you know, I've been doing this for 20 years. 20 years is a good run for a director. Time to do something else. So she is going to technically retire from feature directing. However, she will be involved in a lot of cultural activities in Los Angeles, theater work. She will be teaching film in the early 60s at UCLA. And she will also be directing Pepsi Cola commercials for her good friend, Joan Crawford, of course, who has connections with Pepsi due to her husband.
One of Joan's husbands who passed away, but I think Joan remained very active on the board of Pepsi, and I'm sure provided gainful employment for Dorothy Arzner as a result.
Precisely. And I guess the question is, how did Dorothy Arzner get into the directing scene, especially at a time when, now in the 1920s, there were virtually no women directing. The great Lois Weber was winding things down. The year Dorothy Arzner got started was, I think, the year Lois Weber directed one of her last features. But she had been doing all this work as an editor and even as a writer at Paramount. She had received a directing offer at Columbia when the head of production at Paramount, B.B. Schulberg, said, wait a minute, don't leave. You want to direct, you can direct here. So that's what led to her directing in 1927.
I can't think of another major studio. Somebody will correct us on this perhaps, but until Ida Lupino comes along in the late 40s with that terrific run of independent features, you know, starting around 48, 49, I can't think of any other, but maybe somebody will correct us on that. Studio woman director credits.
I know Mrs. Wallace Reed directed a feature somewhere at the very beginning of the talkie era, but you're right. Other than that, it was a pretty much a quiet scene.
An extraordinary state of affairs. Now, would you agree with me that the first 40 minutes or so of the picture is kind of innocuous, and then things shift into a very different gear at about the 40-minute mark in the burlesque house?
It does, and the complexities of Dance Girl Dance can be related to the two lead actresses. You've got two completely different kinds of actresses in the lead role. Lucille Ball and Maureen O'Hara, two completely different approaches. Maureen O'Hara, fairly new to the pictures at this point, and she's on the eve of a major breakthrough, appearing for John Ford and How Green Was My Valley, yes, and so on. Lucille Ball has been kicking around a little longer at RKO. This is really almost a Lucille Ball vehicle, and she steals every scene that she's in. And the debate we can have is, how convincing is the casting of Maureen O'Hara's character? She's sort of a goody-goody character, but then she agrees to become the stooge. And then towards the end, she has this outburst, this very memorable, legendary outburst on stage. Does that seem out of character? Is that consistent with her character's evolution during the narrative? These are answers that perhaps our audience can join in later on as well. I don't know what your thoughts are, Gary.
Well, I was really struck also by this scene to be that Maureen O'Hara took this tremendous leap in gravitas somehow between this film and How Green Was My Valley, under John Ford's first of many John Ford films that she made, where she's a very serious, very dramatic role, which she pulls off beautifully. Where in this film, you get the sense she's still kind of finding her sea legs, so to speak, and it shows. But I guess it suits the somewhat callow nature of her character. I keep, that line that's used, or that description that's used numerous times in the film, describing her as the stooge. Mm-hmm. I wonder whether today it seems like a very cuttingly cruel phrase. I wonder if back at that time, stooge had a slightly different connotation, perhaps more affectionate. The Three Stooges were already in action at that point, right?
They were. But then you also had, in the early 50s, around 53, Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis did a comedy at Paramount called The Stooge, where Jerry Lewis's character was hired to be a comic buffoon for the Dean Martin character doing his singing work on stage. Obviously, that's a mirror of the actual Martin Lewis template. the stooge, it's almost comic relief. And it's,
So, but also it seems if what we've covered the whole rainbow of expressions for it, cuttingly casual sexist cruelty, which I guess was not
Well,
surprising at the time.
it's, I mean, I think the term stooge transformed men and women. It was here normally we associate stooges with being men in comedy, but here it's unusual to see a woman playing that part. But certainly you wouldn't expect the sleazy atmosphere of burlesque to be progressive in its political outlook. You would expect for performers of any stripe to be humiliated and degraded, whatever fit the needs of the audience, who could be throwing food at the stage. This was not a sophisticated cultural environment, so you would expect an element of humiliation and degradation to be part of the ritual.
You have to wonder whether that was Dorothy Arzner, encouraging these guys to just let it all hang out. These long shots of the audience members, shouting and, give us some action and all kinds of, raspberries. And then we see early in the film when Lucille Ball is auditioning this extreme close-up of a so-called talent master, puffing on a stogie, mercilessly. Was this coming from the ADs, or is this really Dorothy Arzner's signature in this picture?
Well, that's Harold Huber as the cigar chomping burlesque auditioner. We see him in a lot of Warner Brothers pre-codes in the early 30s. And yes, that's some pretty unsettling, extreme close-ups of his face. Unsparing. And one can only imagine that would have resonated with primarily women who are auditioning in show business. And these cigar chompers are going to decide whether they're going to appear in the chorus line or in the nightclub act or on the burlesque stage or in a short subject at a studio. It's awful.
And what do we think of Maureen O'Hara's big speech in the film? Where is that coming from? That also comes out of left field to some extent, or the length at which it's given. And can we think of other pictures where that, actresses tried to pull that off?
I can't think of it's unusual for a picture of this era in the early 30s and it was anything goes. It might not seem too out of place, but this is certainly unusual to see that kind of a response from her. And is it convincing for the character? It's a fascinating development, but she's been pretty passive up until that point. And we're trying to get a sense of her going along with being the stooge, because first she realizes that she's been brought in to be comic relief for this Lucille Ball number. But then she says, I'll take the job, I'll take the money. And then, of course, there's this meteoric rise based on her being a stooge. We're maybe not getting enough. For me, I would have liked a little bit more of information as to how she was responding to that and the evolution her character was taking. But that was just my response.
No, I would agree with that. I mean, maybe Katharine Hepburn could have gotten away with a speech like that in some of her early films, and
yes,
and she did. But
no,
that's something else entirely.
And Maureen O'Hara, her background, she had studied with, she actually came from Ireland, of course, but she was trained at the Dublin's Abbey School. She's going to make her film debut in England at the age of 18. And then producer Eric Palmer, who produced this film, which we'll talk more about him, and his production partner, Charles Laughton, signed her to a contract. She is cast opposite Laughton in Hitchcock's Jamaica Inn the previous year, which was Hitchcock's last British film before coming to Hollywood.
Mercifully.
Yes, mercifully. And then she will, as you mentioned, get a big boost from John Ford in How Green Was My Valley. For a director as tough as Ford and as delicate as one would think Maureen O'Hara was, she took direction from some pretty tough guys. John Ford, she was directed by Sam Peckinpah in The Deadly Companions.
Right. But she didn't pay much attention to Peckinpah, I don't think, from what we read about that film. That was his first feature.
Yeah, so she could hold her own against some pretty tough people, and she worked for Ford on several occasions. He directed her in Wings of Eagles and Rio Grande and The Quiet Man.
Quiet
Long Play
Man,
Line.
which my son once described as Irish exploitation when we saw it in a theatrical screen.
It's an acquired taste for many people.
Mhm.
And Lucille Ball had been getting bit parts in Hollywood and then was under contract at RKO in the mid-30s. You see her as a maid in a Fred Astaire, Ginger Rogers picture, and then she starts getting, in the late 30s, more starring parts.
Spoiled for the Marx Brothers and Room Service.
Yes.
Yeah.
And here you really do get a sense of her talents. It seems as though the industry vastly underutilized her during the 1940s. She is going to, in a few very short years, be at MGM, who's really not good. MGM, as we know, didn't know what to make of talented, comedians, and they always seem to water them down. And Ball, who was such a great comedian and even does her own singing here, 3 years later is going to be crudely dubbed in a musical Best Foot Forward with a voice that doesn't even match her personality. But you may have some other thoughts about her.
Well, the thing before we go to Dan and cinematographer Russell Meddy, who's certainly one of the greats of that period. You were mentioning that Dorothy Arzner wound up teaching at UCLA in the film school in the early 1960s, where one of her students was a young Francis Ford Coppola. And then I think their paths, if I'm remembering this correctly, and maybe you can verify, this would have been in the last year of her life, but I think she wound up at Coppola's Zoetrope Studios in the late 70s as some kind of on-staff person there advising him about his ill-fated musical One from the Heart, which went into production in the late 1970s. And she was, I think, somehow briefly there, along with people like Michael Powell and Gene Kelly.
Kelly, yes.
Yeah.
I didn't know that. I didn't know that.
I think that's correct, and somebody may verify that or not. But that's again one of those amazing arcs, half a century of a singular life in pictures, whatever we may think of the filmography overall.
True, and if you look also at some of the credits, the editing credit for this film, it's by a young man named Robert Wise.
Oh yes,
on the eve of co-editing Citizen Kane, and then of course.
A hero and a goat at various times of his career. A hero and a goat at various times of his editing career for reasons many of us know about.
Yes. And there was another aspect of Dorothy Arzner, by the way, for those, if you do get the Criterion Channel, they currently have the film we just showed at New Plaza, Merrily We Go to Hell, but they also have a terrific Paramount film she made the year before that, with Claudette Colbert, called Honor Among Lovers, which co-stars Frederick March. I watched it last night and it's fantastic.
But that's not an easy one to see, too.
So that's on the Criterion Channel. Other people in the film, we have Maria Ospinskaya as the older sort of agent who's trying to get work for Maureen O'Hara, who suffers that rear projection car attack on Fifth Avenue. She came from the Moscow Art Theater and is going to head to Hollywood in 1936. Dan, clearly that was an in-joke that she was dressing with us in a tie and a suit, very similar to how Dorothy Arzner dressed at that time.
Everything but a cigar in her mouth.
Right, precisely. And then we had Ralph Bellamy, who is able to break through some of his stereotypes as a semi-dumb hick, playing more of a romantic lead here, although he's going to be frustrated with his typecasting and end up going back to Broadway.
Well, the cinematographer Russell Meddy, ironically, you guys may have noticed his name popped up in the New York Times on Friday in a review of a documentary about Stanley Kubrick, which has been sitting around actually for a few years. But he was the cinematographer on Spartacus, with whom Kubrick argued a lot, I guess, about the camera work in that picture. And so 6 degrees of ... which we run into so often on these Zoomcasts.
And I know Dan is going to.
Russell Meddy won an Oscar for Spartacus, by the way.
Wow.
That was his only Oscar.
And Dan is going to tell a little bit more about Russell Meddy's connection. One other brief actor we can point out is Sidney Blackmer, given the rather undignified character name Puss in Boots here. he was a North Carolina actor who actually started playing film roles in 1914, makes his Broadway debut in 1917, appears in 100 films during his career. We know him most famously for the role of Roman Castevet in Polanski's Rosemary's Baby late in his career.
Satan worshiper.
Absolutely. I know Dan has a lot to tell us about in terms of the cinematography. So at this point, our camera cinematography filmmaker expert, Dan Cahill, is going to join us with some thoughts on the look of Dance Girl Dance.
Hello, gentlemen. And
Greetings,
yeah,
Dan.
there's a bit to talk about here. I don't want to waste any time. Um, you guys have already mentioned a couple of things. I just want to show you where Robert Wise is posted on this credit card. He's 4th out of 5. So he was going to assume great heights of filmmaking, but not for another year or so until Citizen Kane came along. Now, Russell Meddy got the top rank on this card, and he was quite something. I'm just going to show you his picture and a list of at least 5 prominent directors he worked for. With Orson Welles, it was Touch of Evil. Douglas Sirk was Written on the Wind. John Huston was The Misfits. Stanley Kubrick, as we said, was Spartacus, for which he won an Oscar. And William Wellman was The Story of G.I. Joe. Just do a little math here. Meddy had a 42-year career, and he had 174 credits. Now, those were not all feature films. Most of them were. Some of them were TV episodes, but it makes you think this poor guy probably never even took a vacation. I don't know, but he was very, very much in demand. And if you've seen any of those films that we mentioned, you will know why. And his talents are on display here. This is Lewis Hayward playing the alcoholic millionaire, Jimmy Harris. And he's in this nightclub where our girls are dancing. And something is flashing a bright light in his face, and he's unhappy with that. And then, oh yes, Bubbles, aka Lucille Ball, notices it and then starts trying to intentionally flash him with the top of her top hat. And that doesn't work. In a beautiful bit of just pure visual storytelling, he pulls a lampshade in front of him because he doesn't want to be flashed by a chorus girl. This is, I think, excellent visual storytelling, as I said, and the lighting and photography come through to make it work. This is a nice little tableau of our 2 co-stars trying to persuade a policeman to give them their pay before they're hustled out of the club. And Jimmy, the millionaire, intervenes and takes up a collection to the extent that this cop actually contributes to them getting paid. But this is one of the first instances of women winning when they assert themselves, and rightfully so. You know, the word feminist came up. I don't know if that was in the popular vocabulary at the time, but I think this would have been called a woman's picture or women's picture. And I'm not sure that does it justice either, but we can talk about that later. Here is a wonderful little tableau that once again pictorially tells you everything. Jimmy is interested in Judy on the right, and Bubbles is sizing up the situation and eyeing her competition. This is just a little cutaway in the midst of a scene where Sally here in bed is chatting with Judy, who is doing some stretching exercises. And the light shines past Judy, casting shadows of her moving arms on the wall. And it's just another nice little visual touch that didn't have to be there, but it just reminds you that there's 2 characters in this scene. Well, here we have every New Yorker's favorite neighborhood. This looks to me like an actual photograph of Times Square. They must have had a second unit on standby, or they probably had this shot in the file. The signage is really interesting here if you get a chance to look at it carefully. And I think that is a good to the last drop sign on the left for Now the brand name is escaping me, but I'm sure somebody will tell me.
Maxwell House, I believe. No, chock full of nuts.
Chock full of nuts. That's it. Thank you. Well, here is the aforementioned Maria Uspenskaya, who came to fame, at least for my generation, a couple of years later as the gypsy woman, the old gypsy in The Wolfman, and later in Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman. She was the one who intoned those wonderful words, "Even a man who is pure in heart and says his prayers by night may become a werewolf when the wolfbane blooms and the autumn moon is bright." And her Russian accent really contributed to that. Now, note her garb here, which very closely resembles most of the photos we have of Dorothy Arzner and how she dressed in public. I don't know if this was a gag between them or some sort of homage, but it does cast a certain light on Maria's character. Now, just to underscore that, here she is going out with Judy to an audition, and she's wearing an extremely girly hat. Hats are kind of important in this era. And what comes of her when she's wearing the hat? Well, for being a femme, she gets run over by a car. That should tell you something about the orientation of this film. Here is the aforementioned Harold Huber. I thought of showing up today with a cigar between my teeth, but I didn't have a small enough hat. But this seems to be the uniform for backstage hustlers in the 40s. This guy doesn't have to do anything, and his immobile face tells the story. We later see him right here smiling at Lucille Ball, demonstrating what oomph is. Now, the word oomph has previously come up in a New Plaza Cinema talkback. That would be the one we did last fall, I think in November, on Woman on the Run, where we talked about Ann Sheridan's frustrating career at Warner Brothers, where they kept trying to market her as the oomph girl. Clearly, she was unhappy with that and other things, so she ended up going very independent soon thereafter. This is Judy waiting outside Steve's dance studio, hoping to get an interview with him. And she is distracted by looking through the open doorway to see the dancers at work. And here is just one example of what she saw. This is some sort of curious blend or mashup, if you will, between standard classical ballet and modern dance. It doesn't quite work for me, but that's what they were working on back in those days, at least at Steve's studio. Just a momentary pause to consider what's going on here. These are two dancers in an extravaganza that Judy witnesses. These are supposed to be an African-American couple. We don't see her face, but his face clearly looks like a white man in blackface. Just acknowledging that this is what Hollywood did at the time. I guess they thought it was easier to put a white dancer in blackface than to find a talented black dancer. I don't know. There's probably no rational explanation for it. This is the beginning of what we would now call the meet cute between Ralph Bellamy and Maureen O'Hara. It begins silently in an elevator. And this is one of the first instances, or actually the second now after showing Harold Huber with his cigar, of what Gary referenced as the male gaze, and it is prominent in this film. We see a lot of men looking at women and reacting to them. And here he is at the end of this sequence where she goes off in the rain and he is looking back at her. But what do we see he's looking at? He's looking at her legs, a close shot of her legs as she's running through the rain. Now, we know he has a professional interest in her legs, being a dance impresario, but I suspect there is something beyond the professional in this. And while we're here, I think we need to acknowledge that the background rear projection, which is, we all know it's not actually happening right behind Ralph Bellamy, but it's rather effectively done. And they get away with the fact that it is raining and it's kind of foggy and hazy. And that helps the rear projection, which is ordinarily kind of in soft focus and a little hazy. I like this scene because there is one line of dialogue here where Lucille Ball says, don't tell him I gave you this. But she's giving the landlady some extra money because she has a lot of money. Notice the frou-frou dog on her arm. And this tells us something about her character, that she's really a good egg and she cares about her friends and she wants to do right by them, although she is an extremely competitive person and doesn't want them to know she has a heart of gold. Here we are in the burlesque show, and this was kind of a gimmick. It reminds me, I never saw or certainly never experienced one of these, but I understand at Coney Island, they used to have what was called a blowhole, where a huge fan would be turned on in a grate under the sidewalk to blow up a woman's skirts. I don't know how long that lasted. I'm sure it's criminal behavior now, but back in the day, this was how women were objectified and mistreated. And these are some of the guys who objectify them. These are the Bailey brothers on the left, the owners of the burlesque. And I think this is Dwarfy, who becomes Bubbles' agent. And this is how men enjoyed themselves when they were, in this case, they're laughing at Maureen O'Hara as Judy playing the stooge. They think it's the greatest thing in the world, and so does the audience. This is what we now refer to as a montage sequence. And this lasts about a minute or so. It shows newspaper headlines trolling through the frame against images of, well, in this case, people lined up, standing room only to get into the burlesque, other shots of people in the movie. And we have no real way of knowing exactly who did this, but I understand that the later very well-known director Don Siegel, who began as an editor, constructed a lot of these sequences. It looks like it was not filmed by the same crew that did all the principal photography because the shots are very different. They could have just lifted some frames out of the film, but apparently this was shot on its own. And they're usually very effective and kind of fun to watch. Now here we have a gentleman, the aforementioned Jimmy, who appears to be sober on a rare moment, and he is doing the right thing, standing up for Judy. And the lout on the left of the frame clearly objects to that and wants to go on mocking her. Interesting scene here. He's out with Judy all night and he's kissed her goodbye and they're making plans. And suddenly he goes all bipolar, as we would say today, and says to her, no, you don't want to be with me. I'll hurt you. I won't be good for you. And then he goes bipolar again and switches back to Mr. Nice Guy and says, okay, darling, I'll see you tonight. This should be a warning to any woman. Stay clear. I love this shot. This is embodying, I believe it was Jimmy describing her as the morning star, Venus, the last star before dawn. And it's just, I think it's a lovely shot. It sort of takes us out of the reality of show business for a moment. And what is really cool that I could not possibly have expressed in a still frame is that the star twinkles. It sort of pulses brightly at the end of the scene. This is the aforementioned Sidney Blackmer, who in this frame, you can almost see the aged 27 years later Roman Castevet, who was on his way to trying to create a baby for the evil one downstairs. Now, here is Maureen O'Hara's famous, well-known diatribe against the audience. And I want to say that they put her through some acting here. Before she does this, we're watching her face and we see her get a little upset. And then you can tell the gears are going around in her head and she's saying, I'm going to do this. And that behavior mirrors the scene previously where she was taunted by Bubbles. Oh, she's going to quit. You'll have to get somebody new to be the stooge. And you see once again a close-up on O'Hara's face where she's going, yeah, wait a minute, I'm going to do this. And then she signs on for it. So there is some acting involved in a transition there, not a lot. And again, we should have more information about what exactly motivates her other than humiliation. And here are some of the new audience people who are reacting, somewhat shamefully. men and ladies in evening dress out for an elegant night on the town, and they have just been humiliated by this cheap burlesque dancer. And this is the last shot I have for you, folks. I could have ended it on the clinch between her and Ralph Bellamy, but something about this hat just really got to me. And I'm sort of signing off with this saying, do you think these hats could ever come back? I kind of wish they would. I don't think they'd last very long, but it would be kind of fun for all concerned. There I am.
Thank you so much, Dan. That was absolutely fantastic. And the big news today is that we are very proud to have in our audience Peter Davis. Some of you may have noticed he sent a message around. He is the son of the screenwriters of Dance Girl Dance, Frank Davis and Tess Salinger. He's also an Academy Award-winning documentary filmmaker who did Hearts and Minds, which New Plaza Cinema had the honor of screening, I believe, last year.
In 2019, actually, Max, and
Oh.
Peter Davis actually came to the cinema, the late lamented waterlogged NYIT theater, and showed the film. Still a terrific documentary, almost half a century later. It was a great screening for us.
That's fantastic. And he wrote today, I can hear my mother's feminist voice in a number of scenes, especially when the character played by, in this case, Maureen O'Hara, tells the male audience exactly what she thinks of them. Tess Salinger definitely had a left-wing background, and we
All
do
of it.
think, I'm sorry.
It was Schlesinger. I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Schlesinger. But I admire Mr. Salinger too. But it was Tess Schlesinger.
Schlesinger.
She was a novelist and a short story writer, and later, and a communist, along with my father. She died before there was a blacklist, but she would have been blacklisted, and my father was for a while.
That's very powerful, and thank you, Mr. Davis. It's such a pleasure having you here today. And
Great.
Call me Peter.
it's almost as though when you see films from this era, you can almost tell if the writer or people behind the scenes were left-wing in orientation or perhaps had been Communist Party members, because the women tend to have a lot more depth and militancy than you might ordinarily see in certain situations. And I think that certainly comes out in this as well. She also, one of her last credits was for the Elia Kazan film, A Tree Grows in Brooklyn.
Right.
Which, and then
Kazan's first picture, I think.
That's right. It was. And well, since you're mentioning A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, my father said that a tree grows.
Oh, you're freezing just a little bit, unfortunately. We've lost some.
Sorry. Yeah. Okay. Well, anyway.
I'm sorry, if you could repeat that. You mentioned your father was referencing A Tree Grows in Brooklyn.
Yeah, anyway, my dad said that A Tree Grows in Brooklyn was a great film that the studio made into a good film. And I'm not sure if he was talking about changes in the script or the way, I mean, the studios at that time, and Kazan agreed with him. They didn't meet at that time, but when they did finally meet, Kazan agreed with him that the studio took over, and since it was Kazan's first film, he didn't. And so they changed it into a good film, according to my dad.
Peter, I have a question. For many of us, this was our first time seeing Dance Girl Dance. I'm certain it's not for you.
Right.
Seen in the present day, what sort of feelings do you have about it and how it might affect contemporary audiences?
I wish I could answer that question more articulately, Daniel, than I can. I pardon me for saying this. I don't really think it's a great film. Again, maybe Arzner's didn't have the final cut either. I think there are a lot of interesting things in it, a lot. I don't really think it's a great film. I haven't seen that wonderful film that she made in the early 30s, or at least I think it is probably a wonderful film that had Frederick March in it.
Narrowly we go to hell.
I-
Guys, I'm gonna have to bail, but if somebody wants to
Okay.
describe Day for Night going out of release after 50 years from Warner Brothers, the same studio that released Peter's Hearts and Minds, I think that will suffice.
Certainly. Thank you so much, Gary.
All right.
Yes, we're very grateful to Gary because he has brought in Francois Truffaut's Oscar-winning Day for Night, which is going to be screening at our West 67th Street Cinema this Sunday, this upcoming, or a week from today, I should say. And that'll be, I believe, a 12:15 screening. It is going out of release, so we're very fortunate to be screening this very inspiring filmmaking movie. For the foreseeable future, it won't be available. We'll
This
be
is
seeing it.
your last chance to see it on a big screen with other people.
Peter, did your father discuss Dorothy Arzner at all? Do you recall any thoughts he might have shared with you?
No, because I don't think they even ever met. He didn't meet Kazan until years later at a cocktail party.
That was not uncommon, though, for the screenwriters not only to not meet the director, but sometimes the screenwriters didn't even meet each other. In this case, they were married, so
Well,
they had
that's
to have met each other. So this was an exception.
That's true too. But
Everything was
my
so
parents-
assembly line
okay.
in
Yeah.
that sense. And somebody asked about Day for Night, why is it going away? There was apparently a 50-year distribution agreement with Warner Brothers, and that contract has expired. So something else will be worked out. But for now, it will be in limbo very shortly. So we're very lucky to be showing it. And that's going to be a week from today. You go to the newplazacinema.org website. There'll be more information on that.
I want to say thank you. I have to bail now too.
Sure.
But thank you, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be talking and listening. I loved what you all said. Daniel Cahill, you told me things I never knew. So thank you all.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Peter,
Okay.
and thank you for being here. It means so much.
Come back
Thank you.
again sometime. Join
I'd
us.
love to. I'd love
Okay.
to.
That's terrific. I did want to get a plug in for the producer of this film, Eric Palmer. He was a relatively experienced producer. I'm being sarcastic. He has my award for greatest studio producer ever. He was a German genius who oversaw film production at the great UFA studio in the 1920s before having to flee Germany upon the Nazi takeover. He came from Germany, of course. He started working for Gaumont when he was 18. He later became the company's director of operations in Central Europe. He survived World War I injuries and then formed a film company that will eventually be absorbed by the great German UFA studio, which was second to Hollywood as one of the greatest production facilities in the world. And under Palmer's supervision, he is going to be supervising the following films: The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, Fritz Lang's The Indian Tomb. These are silent films. Fritz Lang's Destiny, Fritz Lang's Die Nibelungen, a little science fiction film called Metropolis, the first of the two Dr. Mabuse films by Fritz Lang. He will later produce Lang's Spies and Lilium. He will produce F.W. Murnau's The Last Laugh, Phantom, Tartuffe. He will produce Carl Dreyer's film Michael, which was an early film to overtly deal with homosexual themes. He will produce Joseph von Sternberg's The Blue Angel, and eventually Hitchcock's Jamaica Inn. This is by that time he's working his way to Hollywood, having previously produced Garson Kanan's They Knew What They Wanted. or I think that will come after Dance Girl Dance. And then Palmer is going to return to Hollywood, or from Hollywood to Germany in 1946 to oversee the reconstruction of the shattered German film industry. So Palmer deserves a bit of a plug.
Yes,
Anything
yeah.
you'd like to add at this moment, Dan?
Gosh, no, I think we've covered most of the points I had. I I still think it's interesting that this is, by today's standards, a feminist film, and they would not have called it that back then. But I'm not sure that the term "a women's picture" quite sums up what this did that other women's pictures didn't. It's got a sensibility behind it, which is kind of guiding a lot of the choices in the storytelling and the depiction. So here's to Dorothy Arzner, I think.
Definitely, definitely. And before we open up the floor to more audience members and participants, we've got a busy few weeks. In a few weeks, it'll be quite busy here at New Plaza Cinema. We have two back-to-back lectures that I'm going to be giving. The first is an encore lecture on a Tuesday night, and then the next day we're doing an afternoon lecture, which ties into our next talkback, which I'll mention. But first, I will give you a couple of little trailers of what's coming up at New Plaza. We're going to start with the encore lecture on Tuesday, the 11th of April. So it's 2 weeks from Tuesday.
Grab your coat, get your hat, leave your worries on the doorstep. Just direct your feet to the sunny side of the street. Can't you hear the pitter-patter? The happy tune is your step. Life can be sweet on the sunny side of the street. I used to walk.
So that is going to be 2 weeks from Tuesday. And the next day, we're doing a brand new presentation that we've never done before on television news and how that has been portrayed in movies on TV. This will give you just a little bit of a taste of some of the excitement to come. And that will be in connection with our next online talkback on Sunday, April 16th, which is Sidney Lumet's network. So we look forward to, so that's going to be the week of April 10th is going to be very busy at New Plaza. Please join us online if you can. Lori, we welcome your participation.
Hi, everyone. If anyone has a question, please use the reaction button or raise your hand so we can call on you. Just a couple of thoughts I had. When he said the line to Maureen O'Hara about having blue eyes, the first thing I thought is she doesn't have blue eyes. If anything, Lucille Ball, like it just bothered me, and like they didn't even make an attempt, because sometimes in black and white, if you have very light blue eyes, they used to put in contacts because they didn't photograph well. But yeah, she didn't have blue eyes. But I and several of the people in the audience totally were appalled by the lack of quality dancing. Even when she's watching the woman in the sparkly outfit, it was like I mean, and then last night I went to the ballet and I'm like, their arms are just like one, like there's no separation at the wrist. It's just, and I mean, when she was dancing around the dance mistress's apartment, I was like, what the heck is she doing? I cringed every time I saw it.
Hollywood has a long and proud tradition of staging very tasteless and tacky ballet numbers. And this, even when George Balanchine choreographed ballet sequences for the Goldwyn Follies, they were in really bad taste. And he was a great choreographer. I don't know what that was about, but here's an example of the not very tasteful.
Let's please bear in mind that Maureen O'Hara had a stand-in double in a lot of the wide shots where her back is to the camera. You can't see her face. That's someone doing an ostensibly slightly better job of Maureen at the dancing.
So she
That would be incorrect.
Yeah.
As someone who grew up in the loving ballets, going to Lincoln Center every Christmas to see the Nutcracker and seeing Nureyev and Villela and some of the great dancers of all time. Dancers like lift themselves. Like, I can't explain this ethereal, they can almost like suspend in air before they land. And every time she landed Maureen O'Hara, I felt like I heard clunk, clunk. It drove me nuts. It really did. But anyway,
no, that's a great point. No, but and I wanted to, Lori, you reminded me, there's one thing I wanted to add, because I know Dan did mention in that wonderfully tasteful, I say ironically, dance sequence, you do have the blackface characters. That, of course, there's a long history of blackface performance in show business. And I am sending right now to everybody a very interesting book called Blackface, White Noise, Jewish Immigrants in the Hollywood Melting Pot by Michael Rogan. Fascinating history of the use of blackface in American show business. It's from 1999, definitely worth reading. It's just, it's a thing, I never got it, but I know it was a massive major point element of show business.
I thought it was also interesting because when they showed the musicians, they weren't in blackface. So I didn't understand why the focus on these two dancers and putting them in blackface. I didn't get what the point was.
A theory that I have, I have never found this actually written down in any Hollywood censorship acts, but I know that interracial mixing of actors was discouraged, like extras, dancers, performers in this era. There were always exceptions, but generally it was looked down upon, or I mean, discouraged, that you were not supposed to mix white people and black performers in musical numbers.
Let's also bear in mind that another unwritten rule in Hollywood was the best place to display black talent is on the bandstand. They were always, most of a jazz band or a dance combo, that was one place where they could actually get some honest work in Hollywood.
Exactly. So it's fascinating, the political tone of all these films.
Again, if anyone has any questions, please go to the reaction button and raise your hand. Russell, can you unmute and start your video? Hi, Russell.
Yes, good evening. I had a comment and two questions. The comment is, I read that Ferdinand the Bull, which seemed to have a large part in this film, was actually an actual placement for a Disney film, the RKO, because RKO was apparently distributing Disney films at that time, and so this was actually the first product placement out there. I don't know if that's true, but I had read that.
That's a great observation, because because they're on the verge of releasing Saludos Amigos, which was a Disney wartime political tub thumping for the so-called good neighbor policy. But Ferdinand was an important. If memory serves, it's a an animated segment film, and the Ferdinand the Bull was one of them, if memory serves. Great observation.
The
Yeah,
Disney logo.
I'd never heard of Ferdinand the Bull,
Oh.
so I didn't know.
Wait, and you reminded me of another thing. There's that great, that stock footage of Times Square that Dan pointed out. You see the Lowe's Criterion is presenting a Disney Fest, 5 movies,
Yes.
including
Imagine
Snow White
that.
and the Seven Dwarfs.
Yeah,
Just sheer coincidence,
Sheer coincidence.
of course.
I don't think so.
And then my question was, I had read that somebody described this film as a B film, and also as the film was high camp, and I've never been exactly sure what people mean when they say those two things.
The first was they were describing it as a B film.
Yes.
I wish I had access to the budget. I'd have to go to UCLA for that in Los Angeles. It doesn't strike me as when I think of B, I'm thinking of a low budget movie that may have been shot in under 10 days. Usually they run under an hour and 10 minutes. This was a full hour and a half. And I'm sure it had a very pleasant budget. I don't think it was a low budget or a 10-day wonder or 7-day wonder that we associate with a so-called B, bottom half of the double bill release.
I was just going to intrude and say that the B picture was usually the second feature after the prominent A picture with the big stars. The B picture, or the co-hit, as they often called it in newspaper ads, that was there just to fill the time and maybe appeal to some of the audience. But the B pictures got less of a promotion, and they usually had somewhat smaller budgets. But once
Not
again,
this one.
I don't think so. I think this is maybe an A- picture.
Yeah.
Or A plus somewhere
I
in
think that's very fair. I'm sure it got plenty of promotional action. And in terms of, you said some people had, I'd labeled it camp.
High camp. They said it was high camp.
Well, see, the problem with the term high camp, and I think it was John Waters who pointed this out, camp is not supposed to be funny. Camp is supposed to be serious, and it's unintentionally funny. I think a lot of Dance Girl Dance was intended to be funny. I mean, come on, you've got Lucille Ball has great lines like that guy's got more arms than an octopus, and the performance that she gives is supposed to be a comedy dance routine that Maureen O'Hara's character is sort of giving a relief from. So I'm not sure if that applies here.
Well, the one comment that somebody said about the B production was, they said one of the reasons was because there's a lot of back projection in this film. And I know that, Dan, you said that there was some, but I don't know. I don't know if there was a lot. I don't have that kind of knowledge.
A lot of the scenes on Fifth Avenue, you see them in front of a screen that you see the Fifth Avenue buses. All of that is second unit photography that would be projected behind the actors.
I was just going to say that Alfred Hitchcock in his A+ productions used a lot of back projection. So that is not necessarily a sign of low budget or carelessness.
And at what point, I was starting to say, you see the Ralph Bellamy and the Maureen O'Hara characters, they're walking down Fifth Avenue, they're on a treadmill, and they're in front of a back projection screen. But that was common. They were doing that, at least through All About Eve in 1950. Not enough audiences questioned that as a way of, it was a way for Hollywood to suggest locations without having to actually go to the locations and spend more money filming on location.
One quick last question is, I had read that Dorothy, is it Arzner?
Yeah.
That one of her gifts was that she knew what to do with people, because I keep hearing that, Lucille Ball, they didn't really know what to do. So many stories, they did not know what to do with so many of these actresses. They said one of her gifts was that she really did know what to do with many of these actresses and so on. And that was one of her strong points and one of her gifts. Thank you so much for your time.
Oh, thank you. And that's a great piece of information. And I would agree that some actors have gotten they were taking some risks. They were allowed to take risks.
She had a reputation for working very well with actors who wanted to work with her again. So that's pretty much of a testament to a good director, I would think.
Thank you, Russell.
Thank you, Russell. KB, you have your hand up. Would you like to unmute and start your video? Hi, KB.
Hi,
Hey,
Kathleen.
Kathleen, hello.
How are you? Hold on a minute, let me move my computer here. Thanks a lot for suggesting this film, because honestly, I wouldn't have watched it unless you suggested it, because the title, Dance Girl Dance, just is not very, it's not something I would have gravitated towards, right? And actually, speaking of the dancing, Lori, I hear you. I love the ballet, and this is not that, right? And maybe it's because the dancing was just a vehicle to show off women in their bodies, right?
Or it was a way also for Hollywood to show we got culture. Look at the culture we got. We got ballet. I think that's another theory anyway.
Because
Yeah.
even the woman, to your point, that she like was watching and thought, oh, I could never be that good. I didn't think she was very good, not as a ballerina. And I think the only reason the rest of the dancers in that scene looked ballet-esque was because they had a lot of fabric moving around. So the fabric like more flowy,
Right.
but the girl in the shimmery dress, again, very clunky, very clunky.
Yeah. It reminded me a little bit of An American in Paris. Some of the music, some of the stylized way of it. The other thing I was going to say is I was really glad that you guys recommended this film, because I have a very limited view of Lucille Ball as from I Love Lucy, as a clown, basically. And I was so shocked to see her as a glamorous person, who's actually, beautiful and talented and sexy, like Mae West. And so I was really surprised.
Stunning.
Stunning.
She
She's
was
stunning.
This is a perfect moment for me to plug a little-known Lucille Ball film. The title is Lured, L-U-R-E-D, not lurid, which describes movie posters, but lured as in drawn into something. And it is a suspense film about using Lucille Ball. This takes place in period London, and they use her as bait for a serial killer. And she is really good. It's directed by Douglas Sirk. Other co-stars are, who's the guy who married Zsa Zsa Gabor? George Sanders. Anyway, it's got an excellent cast, and if you can find it, it's not hard to find. Lured. Check it out. 40s.
Thank you. I'll look for it. Then the last thing I was going to ask is, I thought it was interesting that they did the film in black and white. And I wondered your thoughts, especially you, Dan, as to why you think they shot this in black and white.
Money.
Really?
Color doesn't really come into play until the 50s, when they make single strip negative color film. Because prior to that, it's the 3-strip process, and whatever color, it really black and white was the rigor of the day for a very long
Because
time.
color was massively expensive at this time. In 1940, to make a Technicolor picture, it had to be a Cecil B. DeMille epic, a big Western and outdoors movie that justified that kind of expenditure.
Yeah.
It was kind of pick and choose.
Exactly. And as Laurie said, in the early 50s, they came up with a more economical way. But it usually wasn't a choice on the part of the directors. That was the accepted normal way of doing production.
And RKO was not one of the wealthier studios. I don't know if they did any color films prior to 1940. Do you think they did?
Well, of course they released Disney's pictures in the with Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, which were Technicolor, but those were outside productions. But as for films they made in Technicolor on their own, I'd have to do some thinking on that. But you're right, they didn't.
They don't spring to mind.
Well, I'll tell you.
They were a Poverty Row studio.
Well, here's the thing. And we talked more about this when we discussed Orson Welles, but when Orson Welles was finished with The Magnificent Ambersons in 1942, he went down to Brazil to shoot a film called It's All True for RKO, which was never finished, but that had a lot of material in Technicolor that was supposed to celebrate the Carnivale event down there, although it was shot on a studio down in Brazil. But that was one of the more unusual examples of an RKO picture in which Technicolor, they invested in Technicolor. Unfortunately, it didn't get finished.
I've talked about this before, but early color films, especially the single strip color negative, didn't always hold the dye lot.
Hmm.
So if you ever see a film that has sort of a magenta hue to it, that's why. That's like very early single strip color negative. Didn't wear well.
Because we've talked about Technicolor before at New Plaza, and I've always likened it to the artistic process of what's the term I'm thinking of when you silk screen. Think of it as a silk screen where you're doing a picture and you have to prepare a screen for each color, and the color paint is wiped on with a squeegee onto a piece of paper. Then you clean the screen and you change color, and from that you have a full color painting of some kind. That was how 3-color Technicolor prints worked, where through a laboratory process, they were literally wiping different color chemicals onto the prints to create this insoluble, long-lasting color that under normal circumstances lasted forever, as opposed to these cheaper devices Lori was talking about.
Wow, that's intensive.
Not to mention.
There's going to be a test on this, Kathleen. Just
Sorry,
It's
my
on the
film
exam.
history teacher is coming out, Kathleen.
No, practically speaking, the Technicolor camera was a monster to move
Huge.
around on a set, and it was not a practical way to make a film. So, there's all these things going against color in 1940.
Wow, that's amazing.
1939 is considered the year with the most creative output in Hollywood, and that's the year that like The Wizard of Oz,
Yes.
Gone with the Wind, that was like a big heyday for the Technicolor 3-strip. But again, 3-strip, it's 3 pieces of film going through the camera, 3 pieces of film that have to be processed and then composited all together to make the color film. So
I didn't realize
very
all.
expensive.
Really makes me appreciate
Yeah.
Wizard of Oz a lot more. We should do one.
exactly.
We're
Yeah.
going to open up a film school soon, and you're invited to enroll.
There you are. Nice to see you all.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Kathleen.
Bye.
See you soon.
Russell Has another question. Russell? Or
Yeah, this is
comment?
actually, I guess, just a bit of a comment. I think it's a bit interesting or ironic that Lucille Ball ended up owning RKO Studios, which was a distributor of this film.
Yes. Yes. RKO, as many people are aware, went through some management changes throughout the 40s, the worst of which was the takeover in the late 40s by Howard Hughes, who he owned it for a while, then he sold it, then he rebought it, and he was treating it as a toy and didn't overspending, and then finally just gutted its assets and sold off different portions. And Desilu Productions, her husband Desi Arnaz at the time, purchased the studio facilities of RKO, which was next to Paramount Pictures in Hollywood, one of their studios. So that's an incredible irony, absolutely.
And just for you trivia fanatics out there, RKO stood for Radio Keith Orpheum. The middle name Keith was a chain of movie houses throughout the country. I went to a few Keith's movies back in the day.
RKO was also the Kennedys' foray into Hollywood. Like if we
Yeah.
ever wonder, like the Kennedys, Jack and Robert, had affairs with Marilyn Monroe, allegedly, that's how they had that Hollywood connection, was through their dad back in RKO.
Joseph Kennedy was a player in the 1920s, had a number of distribution companies and sold them to this consortium that became RKO. It was this crazy, massive merger. Radio was part of RCA. And then Dan mentioned Keith, and Orpheum was another circuit. So you had these massive circuits merging with these groups of independent distributors to create RKO, which was the most problematic studio. They had the most financial problems during their 3 decades of existence.
I do believe per the consent decree, though, they were the first to officially separate exhibition from distribution.
I know the last was MGM. MGM Lowe's held out as long as they could.